Welcome to a new video by ShoZEN Infinity. I hope you will have an amazing blessed day. Now today what I want to look at is an article on Business Insider called 50 New York City Buildings That No Longer Exist, published in 2013 by Max Rosenberg. Now, when someone asks you to describe New York City, especially its architecture, I think that most people who don't live in New York City will think of high, glass skyscrapers. So what I'm going to present you in this video may shock you if you've never visited New York City or if you don't live there, like me, who hasn't ever been to New York City before. And like this image here of a mansion that was in New York City, and this looks like something incredible straight out of fantasy. So be prepared for what you're going to look at, and you might feel mixed feelings in this video because these are destroyed buildings. These have been demolished. They do not exist anymore for whatever reason. For further ado, let's get into the video. Here in the introduction of the article, it states New York City is constantly evolving. As the city has grown, classic structures have been destroyed to make way for new development, or replaced with more contemporary versions. The first building we are going to look at is Madison Square Garden, which was located between 5th and Madison Avenues and 26th and 27th Street. The arena was demolished in 1926. Is the building. Let's just go onto the NYC Architecture website. Here you can see this amazing, beautiful building that was unfortunately destroyed, as with all the other ones. Images of the demolition. And here on the site it says there was once stood a little hotel, and here it shows 1852. And nowadays Madison Square Garden looks like this. Very famous building indeed. The second building we're going to look at is the Knickerbocker Trusco building, which was completed in 1903 at the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue. In 1921 the building got an upgrade, an additional 10 stories, but it lost its columns, which had been a memorable feature. So again, you find these so-called Greco-Roman architecture pillars also in New York. And here on this website, again, you find what the building nowadays looks like. So they added this additional 10 stories on top of this building. It just goes into a bit of history about this building and who owned it and what it was used for. An early sketch of the building. And again, I want you guys to question everything. If they're drawing, horses and buggies and carts, as it's shown in this sketch here, how, it must have been very difficult and required many skilled people in building this building right here. The site today. Exterior view of the Manhattan Club, completed in 1869 at the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue, New York. built for the Irish merchant and businessman Alexander Taylor Stewart. The next building is the Hippodrome, standing on 6th Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets from 1905 to 1939. Makes you question why this was destroyed so quickly in less than 4 decades. It was one of the largest theatres of its time with a seating capacity of 5,200. On Library of Congress, on August 16, 1939, New York City's Hippodrome Theater closed its door for the last time. Let me see if there's a reason why this was closed. The famous Harry Houdini performed here. They even got elephants in here performing. There's no reason on this website that states why it closed so quick. Interesting. The old Metropolitan Opera House was built in 1883 near Times Square. It was the first home of the Metropolitan Opera Company, but was demolished in 1967 and performances were moved to Lincoln Center. Just look at the size of these people compared to this building. Located at 1411th Broadway in Manhattan, New York City, opened in 1883 and demolished in 1967. The 9-year theatre was gutted by fire. In 1903, architects Carey and Hastings extensively redesigned the interior of the Opera House. Look at this. The Hotel Astor, hope I'm saying that right, was built in 1904 at Broadway and 44th Street. It was demolished in 1967 and is now occupied by a high rise. Now this hotel was a big, right next to Times Square. Let's see what Wikipedia has got to say about this hotel. With its elaborately decorated public rooms and its roof garden, a grand hotel in 1900. A lot of information on this Wikipedia page about this building. The hotel was completely renovated in 1935 and again in 1949. It was sold to real estate entrepreneur William Zeckendorf on September 1st, 1954. However, he sold it again just 2 weeks later on September 15, 1954 to Sheraton Hotels, which he renamed it Sheraton Ashton. Zeckendorf repurchased the hotel in December 1957, regaining control of it in March 1958 and returning it to its original name. So he sold it just to get it back. During this period, the hotel was managed by Prince Serge. I'm not going to try and say that name. As an indirect result of Zeckendorf's 1965 bankruptcy, the Astor was sold for $10.5 million in 1966, which I'll think back in those days that is a lot of money. It closed and was demolished in 1967 by Sam Muckinscoff and Sons. The site is now occupied by a 54 skyscraper designed by Durr, Scott and Ilan J. Khan and Jacobs, and completed in 1972. The Saig-Feld Theater on 54th Street and 6th Avenue opened in 1927 with a performance of Rio Ritter. It was torn down in 1966 to make room for a skyscraper. Now that's like a reoccurring theme here. Many of these buildings getting knocked down and being demolished to make room for what we know as New York City, and what the thing we pop into our minds with these large, tall skyscrapers. Unfortunately, there's no actual outside image photo of this theatre, but I assume this is the interior and the stage of it. The Louis-Sawn, I think I'm saying that right, Louis-Sawn Stadium was an open-air amphitheatre on the campus of City College of New York that opened in 1915. It was destroyed in 1973 to make way for a new academic center. Now this was very big. Again, you got this Greco-Roman architecture of these pillars going around, and this looks fascinating. It looks like one of those old European theatres. City College impressive old stadium in Harlem. Now look at this. This art piece of this stadium. The Singer Building in Lower Manhattan was completed in 1908 and served as the headquarters of the Singer Manufacturing Company. It was demolished in 1968. Now this is a wonderful piece of straight art. The ability to do this is incredible, and I think this is one of the most impressive ones so far. Let's see what this website has got to say about this Singer Building. Any reason of why it was demolished? Now here's a coloured image of this building. There's a bunch of images on this site, even its interior. And this is what most people think of when someone says New York. Loads of very high-rise buildings and skyscrapers. Just check out this interior ceiling of this building. Note, tallest building ever to be demolished by a company. Okay, replaced by One Liberty Plaza, originally known as the US Steel Building. So yeah, when I was talking about, this is one of the most impressive, looking structures so far, it was the tallest building ever to be demolished by a company. world's tallest building from 1908 to 1909, surpassed by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company Tower. And here, the single building was constructed from September 1906 to May 1908. Just think about that. That's what? Under 2 years? To construct this, the tallest building in, I think, the world at the time, or at least America anyway. Plans to enlarge the single building headquarters at Broadway and Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan began in 1902 when the Sewing Machine Company purchased properties to the north and west. A former design by architect Flagg was 35 stories tower. Singer Company soon decided to nearly double that height. The tower was clad in red bricks and blue stone. Interesting materials. Red bricks and blue stone. Height 612 feet. Now that's very, very tall. Commissioned in 1902. The Ritz Carlton Hotel was built on Madison Ave in 1917, regarded as one of the best hotels in New York. In 1951, it was demolished to make room for an office building. Very big. The New York World Building was completed in 1890 and housed the headquarters of the now defunct newspaper. It was knocked down in 1955. Now there's this building on the left. That is the City Hall, Tribune, American Truck Society. The City Investing Building was constructed in 1908. Because of a real estate problem, the building had an F shape instead of an E shape. It was raised in 1968. 60 years later, they destroyed it. Now this is just amazing image. I could just look at this all day if I could. Now these are the top. These buildings at the bottom is the top of the roof. Just to show how tall these buildings really were. The Commodore Hotel was built in 1919, east of Grand Central Terminal. In 1980, it was completely remodeled and is now the Grand Hyatt New York. It opened on January 28, 1919. The real estate entrepreneur and construction magnate Donald Trump initiated a major renovation which encased the outside of the building in glass and renovated the inside as part of his first construction project in Manhattan. This is what the building looks like today. The St. Paul building opened in 1899 on Lower Broadway and was named after the chapel across the street. It was knocked down in 1958. The Gillander Building was completed in the financial district in 1897, but only stood for 13 years. It was destroyed in 1910 and replaced by a bigger building that combined its neighbouring lot. Here's some more images of the Gillander Building. This seems like the destruction and demolition of the building. Was demolished just 13 years after it was completed and replaced by the banker's Trusco building. The office tower located at the northwest corner of Wall, Nassau and Broad Streets. the most famous intersection in business history. Long occupied by commercial users, the value of the lot at the corner of Wall and Nassau streets rose more than tenfold by 1896, when the owners decided to replace a 6-story structure, the Union Building, with a 300-foot tall tower. Here it says was the fourth tallest in the city, rising to 22 stories on a site of only 26 by 73 feet. Lou Charles Restaurants was in the same location on 14th Street and Irving Place from 1882 through 1982, so a whole century. When the restaurant left for another location, there was a fire in the building years later and it finally tore down in 1995. So here's a picture of the interior of the building. See what this has got to say. So it lives now in North Carolina. Over the years, I've written fairly extensively about Lucho's, the German-American eating and drinking emporium. The Hanover Bank building, also in the financial district, began construction in 1901. By 1931, it was gone 3 decades later. The Hudson Terminal was a rail station in Lower Manhattan. It was built in 1909, closed in 1971, and was later demolished. Now I know we've already looked at this image, but what's referring to is this building here. This one. A coloured image of the Hudson Terminal and Liberty Street Ferry Terminal. Now this is a sketch painting drawing of the terminal. Just look at the sheer size of the building compared to the people. The notes here says, not a mere building, an actual city. Put emphasis on that. Covers almost 2 square blocks with bridges over Day Street connecting the 2 huge structures at the 3rd and 17th stories. One of the largest office buildings in the world, also one of the most up-to-date and one of the best managed, where tenants swear by the Hudson and retain their quarters year after year. Hudson Terminal was the predecessor of the World Trade Center station on the PATH system. PATH is a subway connecting New York and New Jersey. Unlike the other subway lines in New York, it was not built by the city, but was constructed by the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad and its predecessors companies. The main purpose of the H&M was to connect railroad and streetcar terminals on the New Jersey waterfront with points in Manhattan. It was a marvel, written up in engineering and architectural journals, with a carefully planned system of gentle ramps from street level to the mezzanine to avoid the delays in pedestrian flow caused by stairs. This was a very efficient, a lot of thinking was put into the blueprint of making this building. The H&M was sold to the Port of New York Authority in 1962, following years of bankruptcy. The efficient Hudson Terminal Station was doomed by the new owner's plan for the World Trade Center development, which included the Hudson Terminal site and many more neighboring blocks of old buildings. Some parts of the old station track level was incorporated into the World Trade Center, and that is why it is listed here as an abandoned station, still partly in existence, but all of the mezzanine level was completely destroyed by 1971. The remains of the Hudson Terminal reportedly survived the collapse of the World Trade Center towers on 9/11. There was even talk in November 2001 of reusing it. The New York Tribune building was erected in 1875. From 1903 to 1905, 9 more stories were added to the building. It was demolished in 1966. Construction made out of brick, 260 feet tall office building. Now just look at this beautiful red building. Here's what the note says: Brooklyn Bridge entrance ramp, former site of the World Building and the Tribune building located on Park Row. Described at the time as the highest building on Manhattan Island, but the spire was shorter than that on Trinity Church. The Washington building overlooking the Battery was constructed in 1885. It was completely remodeled with a new facade in 1921. Here it listed as a construction finished in 1885, originally covered in heavy dark red masonry, but was remodeled in 1921 with classical Roman white limestone and mosaic details to be more fashionably Beaux-Arts looking. Sometimes called the Field Office, this 258-foot building overlooked the Battery. Architect by Edward H. Kendall. Decorated in the Queen Anne style. The Western Union building was built in 1875 at 23rd and 5th Avenue. It was designed to be fireproof, but burnt down in 1890. Which, if you ask me, sounds a bit suspicious. Was built to be fireproof but burnt down by fire. The Savoy Plaza Hotel was constructed in 1927 on 5th Avenue between 58th and 59th Street. In 1964 it was torn down. "33 floors, 128 meters tall." Very nice image of the building and the surrounding ones as well. You can see there, it was next to Central Park. The Savoy Plaza Hotel dominated the New York Midtown gateway to Central Park for about 2 decades before these 2 skyscraper hotels were built, the Pierre and the Sherry Neverland hotels. 2 blocks and 2 years apart, quickly became 2 of the most recognized profiles in the world until the incursion several decades later of the mammoth General Motors building. The Exchange Court building in Lower Manhattan was erected in 1898. In 1980 it was converted to a modern office building. Here you can see the comparison of the previous building compared to what it looks like nowadays. The building was converted to a 1980s suburban office park HQ of the United Federation of Teachers. Construction of the New York Produce Exchange building began in 1881 to replace an older Produce Exchange. The newer building was then demolished in 1957. Just look at the size of the horses and the people compared to this seemingly humongous building. Looking at the next building, The German-American Insurance Building was built in 1908 on a triangular lot in the financial district. It was demolished in 1971. Again, very one of these slender type architecture buildings. The German-American Building was built by the German-American Insurance Company on the triangular block on William Street, Maiden Lane and Liberty Street in 1908. The Flatiron style building rose over 20 stories or 281 feet high. The Equitable Life Building was built in 1870 in Lower Manhattan. In 1912, it was destroyed by a fire. These images show the aftermath of the fire. Completely devastated and burnt through the building. There's some nice information here. It was the first office building with a passenger elevators. Now, this is the new Equitable Life Building. Still very impressive architecture, if you ask me. A nice menu here. The Wolf Building was built in 1895 in the financial district. It was demolished in 1974 to widen the street. Now here on the image, you are looking at the one on the left here. What catches my eye is the roof of this building with its very intricate, what looks like antennas, but I'm not sure what they are, but like spirals, cone shapes. And here, it looks like a coat of arms of some sort. The 13-story John Wolfe Building, built in 1895 on the east side of William Street from Maiden Lane to Liberty Street. This narrow and stepped building in the Flemish style, considered to be an innovative way to solve various problems of the early skyscraper, was demolished in 1974 for an ill-conceived street widening plan. The site is now part of a glorified traffic island called Louise Nevelson Plaza. The Cotton Exchange Building was completed in 1885 in Hanover Square. It later became the India House, a private club. The original Penn Station was built in 1910. It was sold and demolished in 1962 to make room for a larger rail station and Madison Square Garden. Now, the story of Penn Station is a really tragic one that I think a lot of people don't really understand how monumental this building was and how much it was beloved by New Yorkers. The architects for Penn Stations were McKim, Med and White. We have already mentioned these names before with the Savoy Plaza Hotel. And here's a quote given by a New York Times editorial, October 30th, 1963. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. Even when we had Penn Station, we couldn't afford to keep it clean. We want and deserve tin can architecture in a tin horn culture. and we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. Now, it's just a fascinating, a truly work of art, this building. Just look at the inside of the center of the building. Just look at those pillars and this geometric ceiling and the sheer size. Imagine visiting New York City for the first time, taking a train, leaving the station to see this glorious, welcoming, this is what it was replaced by. Madison Square Garden. As we have already covered in one of the previous buildings. Demolition of Penn Station. In 1963, one of New York City's finest buildings was demolished to make way for a new 116 million sports arena and entertainment complex. Sound familiar? Pennsylvania Station, the monumental 1910 bourgeois masterpiece of architects McKim, Med and White, was leveled and replaced with the fourth incarnation of Madison Square Garden. Now on this website, it is jam-packed with a ton of information on Penn Station, and it just goes to show the significance of the impact of this building and its demolition and controversy. Now alerted, New York's architects, artists and writers were outraged at the prospective demise of such a significant structure. Art and architecture institutes almost uniformly called for Penn Station to be preserved. Many were angered that Penn Station was being taken down to make way for commercial development. New Yorkers will lose one of their finest buildings, one of the few remaining from the Golden Age at the turn of the century, for one reason and one reason only: that a comparatively small group of men wants to make money, wrote the news editor of Progressive Architecture on September 17th, 1962. And I couldn't agree less. And it's not just arts and architecture, it's many other things too. A small group of men controlling the flow of everything, okay? Controlling the world for their own selfish needs. One architect complained that designers beholden to commercial interests threatened the integrity of his profession and offered a suggestion to avoid disputes among architects. Frequently, when we are fighting an avaricious interest, we also have to fight with our own colleagues who conspire with the predators for a fast buck. Perhaps we should have an oath of the type doctors take, which would make it at least hazardous for an architect to conspire against a cultural domain. Several others advocated relocating the new Madison Square Garden complex to another underutilized site in Manhattan, perhaps the one of the city's urban renewal areas. In a New York Times ad put by the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York states, "It may be too late to save Penn Station. It is not too late to save New York. Serve notice upon present and would-be vandals that will fight them every step of the way." As we know now, unfortunately, the battle to save Penn Station wasn't won.
Until the first blows fell, no one was really convinced that Penn Station would really be demolished, or that New York would permit this monumental act of vandalism against one of the largest and finest landmarks of its age. Any city gets what it admires and will pay for, and ultimately deserves. And we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but the monuments we destroy. Ada Louise Huxtable.
One of the worst things that's happened in New York's history is the loss of Penn Station. Penn was so traumatic because this was something that belonged to everybody and that people felt was so beautiful and that they were so proud of, that they just took it for granted and felt that it couldn't possibly be torn down. Could you tear down the Grand Canyon? And then it was, and they put this really disgusting rabbit warren in its place.
How tragic, how sad that so many Americans will never know what it was like to arrive in New York for the first time in your life at Penn Station. It was spectacular. If you had never been to New York before, and you came into the city for the first time, and you came out, and there you were in this breathtaking, man-made, wondrous architectural place. Vincent Scully says that we used to come in to New York like gods when we came into Penn Station. Now we come in to the present Penn Station like rats. It was one of the worst things to happen to an American treasure, not just in New York, but in the whole country.
Pennsylvania Station, the greatest architectural monument of the imperial age of rail, had stood for more than half a century at the corner of 7th Avenue and 33rd Street in New York. When, in the spring of 1961, the financially troubled Pennsylvania Railroad announced plans to tear the magnificent structure down and replace it with a high-rise glass and steel office tower and sports facility, hoping it would bring in more money. Though some voices were raised in protest, the coalition of architects, writers, and historians who tried to stop the demolition could do nothing to save Penn Station from the wrecker's ball. And 2 years later, on the morning of October 28, 1963, the demolition began. It would take more than 3 years in all to pull the great stone structure down. One by one, the enormous Doric columns, winged eagles, and granite angels that had ornamented its facade were cut down, carted away, and dumped in a foul-smelling swamp in the New Jersey Meadowlands.
It is inconceivable that Penn Station was destroyed, demolished for one of the sorriest replacements that one could ever imagine. Everything about the ambition of Penn Station and of the great railroad stations expresses the kind of power that had been concentrated in New York. The loss of it was a sad commentary on the ideology of modernism, the belief that new is better, the belief that modern efficiency or that the profiting from new construction is an adequate replacement for the traditions, the heritage, and the real meaning of places in people's lives.
The loss of Penn Station seemed to many an irrefutable confirmation that the age of rail had come to an end, and that the age of the automobile had triumphed. And in many ways, it had. But more than most people understood at the time, the destruction of Penn Station had marked a crucial turning point in the life of New York City.
It's when that comes down that a sense of sacrilege really activates people. It's destroying the past. It is symbolic of the triumph of the auto era over the old interconnected mass transit operations.
It generated, for many people, a different attitude about the new. You know, maybe the tradition of the new, wasn't something that we should celebrate so uncritically.
I think what was gained was even more important than what was lost, and what was lost was, of course, one of the last really magnificent Beaux-Arts constructions in terms of design and space and material and architectural quality. That was lost. What was gained was an enormous groundswell, popular groundswell for preservation, that not everything was expendable, and that some things were worth a struggle, that you had to find uses, you had to find ways to keep the character and the quality and the continuity of a city. It went far beyond actually losing a station. It really was a sense of what is the city and how do you have that resonance, really, that you get from the past that makes the city rich and real and a rewarding place to be, that it isn't sterile. It isn't the product of building by the bottom line, which, of course, so much construction is.
Nobody seems to care about New York, except for those of us who live and work here. And we, who do care, believe the time has come to put a stop to the wanton destruction of our greatest buildings, to put a stop to wholesale vandalism. It may be too late to save Penn Station, but it is not too late to save New York. Jane Jacobs and the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York.
The City Hall Post Office first opened in 1878. The design was not well received, and it was demolished in 1938, 1 year ahead of the 1939 World's Fair. This City Hall Post Office, I can't really understand why people were displeased with it, because in my opinion this is more than necessary for a post office. So I don't really think that was the case, that they destroyed this because many people, did not like the look of it. Although the site at the triangular tip City Hall Park was chosen for a U.S. post office. In 1867, the elaborately colonnaded mansard roof building did not open until 1878. After a competition with no winner, a committee headed by A.B. Mullett was formed to design the building. Never liked, it was dubbed Mullett's monstrosity, and as early as 1920, efforts to demolish it were underway. Because of a land rights dispute between the city and federal authorities, the building stood until 1938, when the beautification of City Hall Park for the 1939 World's Fair hastened its demise. Abbott recorded the much maligned building a month before it was razed. And it just goes over, her travel and describing of the building and the surrounding areas. Tammany Hall was the headquarters of the Democratic Party for decades. The building on East 14th Street was built in 1830 and was demolished in 1927 to make room for a new tower. The New York Tombs, a prison that also housed courts and a police station, was built in 1838. However, the foundation was weak and the building began to sink. It was replaced by a new building in 1902, which was later demolished in 1974. A very old building, as you can see. Some more images of what they call tombs, but as here states, New York City Halls of Justice and House of Detention. And the architecture is Egyptian Revival building by the architect John Haviland, circa 1870. The luxurious Biltmore Hotel opened on 43rd Street and Madison Avenue in 1913. It closed and was gutted in 1981. The American Exchange National Bank was constructed in 1906 in Lower Manhattan. In 1962 it was destroyed and today is the HSBC Bank building. The Union Dime Savings Bank building first opened in 1906 near Bryant Park. It was demolished in 1956. The Manhattan Life Building was constructed in 1893 in Lower Manhattan. It was demolished in 1963 and replaced by the Irving Trust Company building. Some figures of the Manhattan Life Building. It was 348 feet tall or 106 meters, had 18 floors, was once the tallest building in NYC and in the world as well, lasting for 7 months. Also the first skyscraper to pass the 100-meter mark. panoramas showing Manhattan Life Building. The National Bank of Commerce in Lower New York was built in 1897 but was razed in 1960s. The Drake Hotel was built in 1926 at 56th and Park Avenue. It was one of the most popular hotels in the 60s and 70s. It was eventually demolished in 2007 by developer Harry MacLeod, who was replacing it with a residential skyscraper. The impressive Church of the Disciples, located on 45th Street and Madison Avenue, did not make it into the 20th century. It was built in 1873 but was demolished soon after in 1899. A very nice building to have on a corner indeed. And here's a person stood next to it. I really like what these are on the roof, you know. They look very nice and it makes it very unique in my opinion. The many-towered Church of the Disciples on Madison Avenue at the southeast corner of 45th Street was a heavenly respite from the train shed of Grand Central, and the splendor of Grand Central Station. This view was taken by an unidentified photographer while the church dedicated in 1873 was still new. In 1867, Congregation Emmanuel constructed a temple at 43rd Street and 5th Avenue. It was sold to the Durst family in 1926 and demolished to make way for commercial development a year later. The building type is a synagogue for the Jews, founded in 1845, First Reformed congregation in New York City, consolidated with Temple Beth El in 1927. Here it says it's the largest Jewish house of worship in the world. The facade of the building features an ark with symbols representing the 12 tribes of Israel, flanked by two very 1920s lions resting on semi-columns. At the top, the arch wraps around a magnificent wheeled-shaped window which has a very traditional, look of that Jewish six-pointed star. 3 sets of beautiful bronze doors which also bear symbols of the 12 tribes, serving as an entrance. Emmanuel means God is with us in Hebrew. Over 60 other Reformed Jewish synagogues share this name. Temple Beth El was constructed in 1891 at the corner of 76th Street and 5th Avenue. The building was sold in 1945 and was demolished shortly after to make way for an apartment house right next to the water. The Richardson Spite House was built in 1882 at 82nd Street and Lexington Avenue to satisfy a personal grudge by blocking the view of another building. The 4-story building stood until 1915. Steel magnate Charles Schwab built an ornate 75-room mansion on Riverside Drive, which was completed in 1905. It was publicly demolished in 1948. And that is what? 43 years after it was built and constructed. And they destroyed a 75-room mansion. Just look at this. Absolutely amazing looking building. 75, and they destroyed it under 5 decades. Charles Michael Schwab was an American steel magnate. Under his leadership, Bethlehem Steel became the second largest steelmaker in the United States and one of the most important heavy manufacturers in the world. The building covered the entire block between West End Avenue and the Riverside Drive, 73rd and 74th Streets. A very large mansion for just one man. A very fancy entrance into the house here. Here says Schwab purchased the site of the Orphan Asylum Society, encompassing the entire block between West End Avenue and the Drive, 73rd and 74th Streets for $865,000. An unprecedented sum for a building lot in 1901. Construction began in 1901 and lasted 6 years. 6 years to build this. Here it says the US dollar combined of the 75-room house was $7 million, and I can guess that's a lot back in those days. What's interesting is that he died bankrupt as well, so he became a multi-millionaire but died bankrupt. Another very wealthy family, the Vanderbilt family, built a number of mansions on Fifth Avenue in the 1880s. Most were demolished in the early 20th century. On Untapped New York, the then and now Millionaires Row mansions on Fifth Avenue. Here you have the mansion, the Cornelius Vanderbilt second mansion on 57th Street and 5th Avenue, now demolished. Just look at this beauty, comparison with nowadays. Let's read this here. New York City's 5th Avenue for almost 200 years has been considered the center of wealth and glamour in New York City. What began as an undeveloped parcel of land in 1785 quickly developed into one of the wealthiest areas of the country as development of the city pushed northward. Between 59th and 78th Streets, rich New Yorkers like Cornelius Vanderbilt and John Jacob Astor purchased and built extravagant homes along Fifth Avenue, some valued at over $150 million today. Use our nifty interactive tool to drag between them then and now with these lost gilded mansions on Fifth Avenue's Millionaires Row. Before I want to look at the architecture of these amazing mansions, we have to look at and understand the Gilded Age, because many of these buildings are listed to have been constructed during this time period. So what here Wikipedia states about the Gilded Age is, in United States history, the Gilded Age was an era that occurred during the late 19th century, from the 1870s to about 1900. The Gilded Age was an era of rapid economic growth, especially in the northern and western United States. And to grasp it even more, the images shown here of the Gilded Age really puts it into perspective is the economic gap, the growth of an economic gap between the rich and the poor. During this era, America became more prosperous and saw unprecedented growth in industry and technology. But the Gilded Age had a more sinister side. It was a period where greedy, corrupt industrialists, bankers, and politicians enjoyed extraordinary wealth and opulence at the expense of the working class. So with that understood, you start to understand why, where all these rich people, wealthy families came from and how they managed to afford and build these amazing buildings and what we're going to look at, these mansions. Carrying on for what the website talks about these mansions on Millionaires Row. Although most were demolished in the 1920s due to rapid urbanization and construction of skyscrapers and the advent of income taxes, some still remain, while remnants of others are scattered throughout the city. For those that were demolished, however, department stores and office buildings have obscured this history. The elaborate, ornate mansions that would serve as party spaces for elite have transformed into retailers selling chocolate and clothes to tourists. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace. Now just look at this compared to what it looks like nowadays. Stunning. In 1882, William Henry Vanderbilt, the eldest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt, bought an entire block between 51st and 52nd Streets where he built the Triple Palace. The three nearly identical brownstone homes were for himself and his wife, along with his two daughters, Emily and Margaret. Another wealthy New Yorker, Henry Clay Frick, reportedly said, "This is all I shall ever want," on a drive past the Triple Palaces. Frick would rent out one of the palaces on a 10-year lease, but he could not buy it due to Vanderbilt's will, which barred George Vanderbilt from selling the home and art outside of the family. Today, skyscrapers stand in place of the palaces, where once there were ballrooms and drawing rooms, there are now retailers like H&M, Godiva, and Juicy Culture. William K. Vanderbilt House. Just look at this. Another one of these seemingly looks like, a castle. Straight out of fantasy, this. Check that out. Compared to nowadays. Affectionately known as the Petit Chateau, the William K. Vanderbilt House was a chateauesque mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, closer to the start of Millionaires Row. The mansion was demolished in 1926 after being sold to a real estate developer, and in its stead rose 666 Fifth Avenue, an office tower. Today the building serves as an office for many law firms like the Schiff Hardin, as well as retail brands like the Hollister Co. and Uniqlo. Again, the Cornelius Vanderbilt second mansion we already looked at before, and here let's look at the little bit more in depth of this mansion. So the Cornelius Vanderbilt second house was a large mansion built in 1883 at 1st West 57th Street in the heart of the Millionaires Row, constructed for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest grandson of the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. The home of Cornelius Vanderbilt II was allegedly the largest single-family house in New York City at the time. Feeling that others were trying to outdo his house, the Cornelius Vanderbilts hired George B. Post to design the new mansion. They enlisted Alva's favorite architect, Richard Morris Hood, to help Post make the mansion even larger in the 1890s. His wife Alice was forced to sell the home in 1926 due to large commercial development projects nearby. After it was demolished, a realty corporation in its place built the Bergdorf Goodman department store, which still stands there today. The luxury department store stretches the whole block, undergoing a major restoration in 2002. Remnants of the mansion are also scattered around Manhattan, including the front gate that are now in Central Park, sculptural reliefs now in the Sherry Neverland Hotel, and a grand fireplace now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This just shows how massive this mansion really was. The Mrs. William B. Ashton House. If you've been listening carefully and watching the video carefully, you will know that I had mentioned the family name Ashton before. So here is the mansion. Very, very beautiful indeed. And then you got the Emmanuel Temple or Synagogue. Back in 1854, William Backhouse Ashton Jr. gifted his wife Caroline Ashton a parcel of land at 34th Street and 5th Avenue, on which one of the first 5th Avenue mansions were built. Check this out again. Just look at this. John Jacob Ashton took over his mother's portion of the mansion, but soon after died aboard the RMS Titanic, which led the family to give up the mansion. The property was sold to developers, and today the Temple Emmanuel stands in its place. The William A. Clark Mansion. This is what it looks like now, just a regular block looking building compared to this. Just look at the intricacy of the designing of this roof and this tower. It could be a chimney, but looks like a tower of some sort. Could be used for harvesting ether energy. Anyways, dubbed Clark's Folly, located at 960 5th Avenue at the more northern end of Millionaires Row, costing an astonishing $6 million to build at the time, or about $150 million today. Now listen to this. The mansion consisted of 121 rooms, 31 baths, 4 art galleries, a swimming pool, a concealed garage or garage, and an underground rail line to bring in heating coal. The mansion was constructed in 1911, but the Copper King only had 14 years in the space before his death. The mansion was sold in 1927 for less than $3 million, or about half of its construction price, and was promptly demolished, making it one of the most short-lived buildings in New York City, now replaced with a 12-story luxury condo building. To this. From this to this. This home was built in 1884 at 68th and Madison Avenue for the president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1912, it was destroyed to make room for an apartment building. Residence of Henry G. Marquand. The ornate Navarro Flats, a luxury apartment building, were on Central Park South in 1882. In 1926, the building was sold and a number of businesses took its place. Called in style the Chateauesque, there was also some Moorish details described, as well as Gothic and Queen Anne in style. You can see the buildings were named Spanish after Spanish cities. A most imposing pile of intensely substantial buildings, elaborated Spanish architecture with Moorish arches, numerous balconies, grand entrances, and highly ornamented facades, unsurpassed interior apartments, single and double floor, built for the wealthiest classes, 8 independent buildings built by Navarro on cooperative plan owned by the James Jennings Macomb estate. The original Waldorf Astoria Hotel opened in 1897, combining the Astor and Waldorf hotels. It was destroyed in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building, and the hotel moved to 301 Park Avenue. The Park Avenue Hotel was constructed in 1878 at 33rd Street. Originally built to provide housing for single women, it was quickly converted into a regular hotel. It was destroyed in 1927. Hotel Piccadilly was constructed in 1928 on West 45th Street. In 1982, it was replaced by a newer hotel, the Marriott Marquis. The New York Herald Building, headquarters of the newspaper, was built in 1894 at 34th Street and Broadway. It was destroyed in 1921. The familiar architects of McKim, Med and White. And today it looks like this. From this. A Victory Arch was erected near Madison Square Park in 1919 after World War I had ended. It was a temporary structure built of wood and was eventually torn down. If you're hearing this right now, I just want to give you a huge thank you for making it all the way to the end of the video. I know it was quite a long one and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, to conclude this video off, the reason I made this video is to show people, like I always do with the old world architecture, and I also want to show comparisons with modernization and how it sometimes has a bad effect, in that a lot of history and arts and true beauties that needs to be preserved is lost, but surely not forgotten. Also, a huge part that I do is making sure the audience questions things. So throughout the whole video, I wanted you to question, how they built this according to the time frame and the tools and the equipment that they were using at the time. Anyways, make sure you subscribe if you're new to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it, share this video with whoever. Till next time guys, peace.